Okay, so this video is going to look at natural selection and kind of how we talk about it in kind of an IB way for tests and so forth. So, first thing we need to talk about when we talk about natural selection are this idea of alleles. Now, the easiest way to define an allele is it's a version of a gene. Okay, so remember DNA is organized into genes. Now, genes make a protein. Okay, so they code for a protein. They give you directions on how to make a protein. Um, and then that protein does something, right? So down here, there might be an allele, a gene that codes for hair color. So different alleles give different ones, light brown, dark brown, that sort of thing. Um, the reality is way more complex, but this is kind of the simplified version. Okay, so we call the alleles you have, the versions of those genes, your genotype. And then whatever that genotype is, allele 1, allele 2, for example, that determines your phenotype. Okay? So here, the phenotype are the different colors of the deer in this case. Okay? Some are light brown, some are light brown, some are dark brown. Okay? So, and what probably happens there is they have different alleles. So those alleles would have the same functions as, right? So they're all responsible for, say, hair color, but they do it in a different way, right? So maybe one does something better if you're talking about something involved in your body. Maybe it's a different color, but they're different, okay? So this leads to kind of the first important idea here is this idea of variation, okay? Individuals have variation. Look around the classroom, nobody's exactly the same. There's variation, right? And variation is where natural selection works. Okay, that's where um, advantages, disadvantages, adaptations start to come in. Okay, so what Darwin proposed by his theory of evolution by natural selection were a couple of things. Okay, um, first he noticed that there's an overproduction. Okay, there's way more offspring than um, the environment can support. So not everybody's going to survive, right? The struggle for existence, survival of the fittest, that sort of idea. Okay? And the second thing he noticed was there's variation, right? Organisms aren't exactly the same. There's slight differences in all kinds of things. Height, hair color, and then at the molecular level in our bodies, some of our cells work slightly better than other people's, and some enzymes work better, some don't. Okay, so these two key ideas here, overproduction and variation, um, are important. Okay, and the other thing he noticed is this variation can be inherited. Okay, so it can be passed on to the next generation. Okay, we know this now. This is DNA, right? But at this time, that wasn't really known. And then he noticed, or he proposed, this idea of environmental change. Okay, so when there's a change in the environment, maybe in this case, um, you know, there was a change in terms of, for some reason, looking at this picture, the light brown deer have a disadvantage, and the dark brown deer have an advantage. Okay, so there's a selection here. Okay, so in this case, the dark brown seem to survive more than the light brown. Right? Some of the light browns still survive, but more of the dark brown survive. Okay? So if you're, and this was a struggle for existence, right? And then what Darwin proposed was the better adapted will survive. Okay? And that's the adaptation. And they'll survive because, but what pushes this is this idea of environmental change. Okay? Something changed in the environment. Um, so if you survive, if you're better adapted to survive, you have more offspring. Okay, you you will reproduce more and have more offspring. Okay, and then what that means is the next generation, and you can see that here. The next generation has more of those alleles that gave a better sense of survival. Okay? And what happens then is the allele frequency changes. Okay? So here, at the beginning here, you had less dark brown. But over some generations, because of this environmental change and selection and a struggle for existence and inheritance and this variation that exists, the allele frequency changes, right? So in this case, the allele for dark colors seems to have an advantage. They're better adapted. So the frequency changes, okay? And this was the basis of natural selection. This is what Darwin proposed. When you're talking about new species and things, which we'll be talking about later, this idea of natural selection is happening many different times on many different alleles and everything else. It's far more complicated. We haven't created any new species here. We've just changed the allele frequencies of those populations. Now you can imagine this happening with hundreds of different alleles on different genes and everything else, and then all of a sudden the changes start to become more significant, and you're moving towards that idea of a new species. Okay? Hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions,